Great, lovely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this workshop on anti-racist practice. We're going to introduce ourselves in a moment, all the people that will be contributing and presenting today. But just quickly before we begin, I just wanted to say that it is quite a difficult topic sometimes to talk about, anti-racism, and whilst often things like this will begin with a guarantee that this is a safe space, I think it's probably more important that we think for ourselves about what is a safe space for us, as that might vary quite considerably depending on the topic and our own experiences. So just to say that whilst we try and create as the best a safe space as we can, to be kind of cautious of what you're comfortable with and only share what you're comfortable with. There will be some opportunities for a breakout room and to talk and discuss in smaller groups, but please only do share and reflect on what you feel comfortable to share and reflect on. And if there's points at which you don't feel comfortable joining in, then that's absolutely fine also. So I think we can get on to introducing ourselves. So my name is Kelly Devenny and I'm a lecturer from the University of York in the Department of Social Policy and Social Work. Hannah?
Hi everyone, my name's Hannah Jobling. I'm a senior lecturer in social work in the Department of Social Policy and Social Work at York as well.
Nikita Samaya can't be here, unfortunately. She's not well, and also the formatting's gone a bit wrong on the slide there, but that's Nikita Samaya. She's got a little excerpt that we've recorded for her.
Hi everyone, I'm Shalisi Awad. I'm a lecturer at Leeds Beckett University in the School of Health, and I lecture in social work, youth work, working with children and families, and social care, justice and recovery.
And I'm Polly Sykes. I'm a lecturer at the University of York.
And I'm Jenny Threlfall, and I'm also a lecturer at the University of York.
Okay, so I'll just briefly outline what we're going to cover in the workshop today, because obviously this is a huge topic and we've just chosen to focus on a few things. So we'll focus first on critical race theory, which I'm sure you've heard of and heard lots about, but we'll focus on that and what this means for good practice. We'll be doing some practical things with you about challenging your own unconscious bias and thinking about your own thoughts on anti-racism in practice. We'll talk about intersectionality and have some personal experience, which was recorded for us by Nikita, who can't be here today. And we'll have a little bit of information about some recent research on minority ethnic social work students. And finally, we'll finish by plugging our anti-racist book club, which is upcoming next year.
So we're going to begin by talking some about critical race theory. We decided to talk about this today because it's been a topic that's been increasingly in the public awareness in the news. Firstly, because of what's been going on in the US, and it's gradually crept over into our political and public consciousness in the UK as well. So I would be surprised if you haven't at least heard the term critical race theory, even if you're not entirely sure what it's all about. So we thought today it would be good to unpack a little bit of what critical race theory actually is and what it potentially means for social work. So you might be aware that critical race theory has largely been critical race theory has largely been talked about negatively in the media and by politicians, both in the US and in the UK. Certainly when I've been talking with our social work colleagues in the US, they have actually been banned from mentioning the term critical race theory. They've been banned from teaching about critical race theory and from talking about what it means with social work students and from using it in their practice. Now, we're not exactly at that point in the UK, but we certainly are at the point where our government ministers, as this quote on the slide here is saying, that the UK government wants absolutely nothing to do with critical race theory. It stands unequivocally against critical race theory. So we know that our Conservative government is against it. But that obviously doesn't mean that everybody in the UK is against it and that we as social workers necessarily need to be against it. So let's think a little bit about what critical race theory actually is. So critical race theory was actually for quite a long time, for about 3 decades, simply an academic field of study, coming mostly out of the field of legal studies and then moving primarily into educational studies. And it existed originally mostly to help us to understand how in countries such as the US and the UK, where we might have thought in the popular discourse that we'd largely moved beyond overt racism, and in countries where we had some sort of civil rights legislation, where we had laws against overtly racist actions, how even though we had those things in place, people still experience incredible racial disparities. So as I've got on this slide here, we can have people saying things like, so yeah, we've got these people saying, obviously, that we have no racism in Britain, but obviously we know that isn't true. We know that there are obvious racial disparities going on in the UK, whether that's to do with wealth, whether that's to do with health, whether that's to do with well-being. And so critical race theory is simply a way of helping us to understand what's going on with this, when we've got people saying there's no racism, and yet we all know that's simply not true. So on this slide, I've got 2 quotes from critical race scholars that help us to understand really what the basics of critical race theory is. So firstly, critical race theory is about helping us understand what race relations, what racism really is about in the UK, seeing as we are here in the UK and interested in what's going on in the UK. So one of the most important things that critical race theory does is just simply to help us look a little bit deeper, to help us to explore what is going on beneath the surface when it comes to race relations, when it comes to where the power really lies. And secondly, critical race theorists are concerned with disrupting, exposing, challenging, and changing racist policies. And so critical race theory isn't just this academic thing. So I'm sure that you've come to this seminar not just to hear about something that's really academic, that's about thinking about stuff, but as social workers, we're all interested in doing stuff as well. And that's very much where critical race theory lies. So critical race theory isn't just interested about thinking and understanding stuff, but it's also interested in doing stuff. So all these words like disrupting, exposing, challenging, that's really where critical race theory is, where it lies. So critical race theory is both about understanding and about doing. So for these next few slides, what I want to do is just show you some of the most important ideas that critical race theory has behind it. And the first of these is the idea that racism is endemic. So that means simply that racism really runs rampant through society. And when critical race theorists are talking about racism in this way, what they are absolutely not saying is that every person in society is an absolute, hopeless, irredeemable racist, and that we may as well all give up now. What they're really talking about is the fact that our institutions, our organisations that our society is based around have come to be in such a way that the experience that people who belong to minority ethnic groups have as a result of being involved in those organisations are different to the experiences that white people have. And so critical race theorists have us think about ideas such as structural racism and institutional racism. Now, hopefully those are ideas that you as social workers have become familiar with, as thinking about as being quite different to individual racism, where the responsibility lies with the individual person, and it's the responsibility of the individual person to address. With structural and institutional racism, it might not be the intention of an individual person to discriminate against somebody of a different race, but it's the way that our organisations are structured that means that people who belong to racial minorities actually experience different outcomes. So we might think about the way that people who, for example, belong to Black racial groups experience different outcomes in our mental health system, or maybe different outcomes within child protection and so on. So the second key tenet of critical race theory that I want to raise is a critique of liberalism. So this is one of those ideas that sounds really academic and a little bit hard to grab hold of, and what on earth does this mean for actual real life practice? But I think it's quite important and actually something that is quite practical. So liberalism is perhaps the key political philosophy that most Western countries are organised around. And one of the key ideas of liberalism is that everybody should be treated the same, and that everybody is, in fact, treated the same. But critical race theorists actually argue that when institutions and societies claim that everybody is treated as equal, when they claim that we are actually neutral and objective towards everybody, that simply isn't true. That society isn't actually a meritocracy where if only we work really hard, where if only we give everything we have to succeeding in society, we will get everything we deserve, we will rise to the top. That in fact society is fair, that actually society doesn't work like that. What critical race theorists argue is that society is actually structured, and that it's structured so that people who belong to the majority, and in the UK, that is people who are white, that they actually accrue unfair advantage because of their race, that they will in fact always rise to the top. And that in fact claiming to be colourblind, that means claiming not to see race, is actually something that is incredibly problematic. Now, a lot of the time we will actually hear people say, I'm colourblind, I don't see race, and think that that sounds like something that is actually really positive. But what that is actually claiming is that I am going to ignore all the problems that come along with race and racism. So I'm going to ignore the fact that somebody might be experiencing unfair treatment because of their race. And so critical race theorists argue that actually to say that our society is a meritocracy, to say that we should be colourblind is actually incredibly problematic, and that it's to turn a blind eye to injustice. And now the third important thing about critical race theory that I want to bring to our attention is the idea that telling stories is incredibly important. And when I'm talking about telling stories, I'm not talking about telling stories in the sense of telling a lie or fabricating something. I'm talking about being careful about whose story we're telling. And so one of the important ideas behind critical race theory is that the story that is normally told in society, the narrative that gets the most play in society, is the story that comes from the people who have the loudest voice. And in our society, that is white people. And so the story that usually gets told within our educational system is the story that belongs to the white majority. The story that normally gets told about social work how social work formed, how social work got its being, how social work spread throughout the United Kingdom, how social work spread throughout the world, is the story of white people. The story of how other countries, other populations, other communities, of how they contributed towards social work, how they contributed towards education, hasn't very often been told. And so a really important part of critical race theory is to allow the stories of other people to be told, whether that's just the story of a single service user and their experience within a particular service, whether that's the story of a single student within social work education, whether that's the story of a single social worker, or whether that's the story of a whole community. It's important that we hear the stories of other communities so that they can challenge the main stories that have been told. And so what we want to do throughout the rest of this this seminar, this webinar that we are presenting today, is to weave through some of these ideas about critical race theory that I've just presented to you. I've put on this last slide some quotes from Wayne Reed, who I'm sure that you'll all be familiar with through the various podcast blogs that he's put out through BASWA. One thing that he's argued is that if we're going to claim to be anti-racist, which is an idea that's very, very close to critical race theory, if we're going to claim to be anti-racist, then it's very, very important that we don't just use that term and not put the actions behind it. So it's very important that we don't just put out anti-racist statements, that we don't just attend anti-racist training, but that we actually follow that up with actions. And so what we want to do today is to suggest some ideas to you about actions that we could possibly take. We're going to offer some time for reflection to you. We're going to offer some counter stories, some of those stories from other people and other communities to you, to help us reflect together about how we can actually engage together in other ways of practicing social work. And so I am now going to hand over to Shalicia for her part of the webinar.
Hello. So my name's Shalicia Ward, as I already said. I am not really wanting to talk to you too much about the picture on the slide. I think the picture kind of speaks for itself. But rather, I want to talk to you about my experience of working with anti-racist people, working with those who are able to offer an equitable approach. So I'm slightly going off script, and the others might be thinking, what is she talking about? But as we were talking, I was thinking sometimes it's important to see the people who we're talking about. So I want to just kind of talk about the fact that in 1997, and this is not a political broadcast or persuasion of anything, but we know New Labour came into power. And at that time, I was starting secondary school. And, you know, they came up with the social exclusion unit, and part of that was about BME was what they was calling it, underachievement, and trying to address people whose family hadn't been to university before, trying to address those social imbalances. And what that meant was that there was a lot of money attached to it, and there was a lot of people talking about it. So I went to a school where actually some of my teachers were committed to that practice. So I was, for all intents and purposes, from a political and cultural point of view, I was quite a rowdy black girl. And we know what how the media portray rowdy black girls, you know, my assertiveness and my confidence in terms of challenging, because I've always challenged oppression, even from why the teachers get to wear coats in a cold classroom and students don't, and things like that. I was always that person that everybody wanted to put forward their voice. But to some, I was seen as a problem because what their unconscious bias was showing or telling them was that I was a problematic black girl, that my behaviour was symptomatic, or it was a demonstration of the social ills, or I was also from a very, very from an area that people thought was very, very bad, from Chapeltown in Leeds, which actually I'm really proud to be from. But what I had was some clearly anti-racist teachers. Not all of them, let me say, not all of them. And I think it's a really good point that was made, that to not be seen as racist but to be anti-racist is very different. And I know when I've encountered anti-racist people in my history and in my current situation, and it's it comes across to the service user. So my form tutor from year 8 to year 11, she was a white woman. She was anti-racist. And what was really good about our relationship was that actually she recognised who she was. She recognised that she was a white woman in a middle-class profession, that she had power over me, not just because she was a teacher, but also because of our racial identities. And she did not shy away from that. And she didn't shy away when I spoke to her about how I felt it was unjust and the things that I felt I experienced at school because I was black. She didn't always know how to challenge it, but she never tried to shut me down, and she never, ever tried to make excuses for the behaviour of others. And she always championed my qualities. So she encouraged me to be on the student council, to use my voice. She would go and talk to teachers on my behalf and say, actually, you've given her detention for saying this, but actually you've got to consider if she was a white student, or if she'd have said it in a different manner, potentially you wouldn't have done that. And to me, that was a very clear demonstration of equity. She didn't always do that for everybody. And a lot of people said, oh, Shalicia is her favourite. It wasn't that. She went the extra mile because she saw potential in me. And for us as social workers, we can often see the potential in our clients, but sometimes we don't recognise the structural inequalities that hold them back. So I kind of wanted to just say, from a personal point of view, to somebody who now is able to do that for others, being equitable is more than just saying, oh, I go beyond equality. It's more than just saying, I recognise that things are not great, but it's about actually actioning and saying, this is what I'm going to do to build those extra crates so that that person can be at the same level. So yeah, I hope that encourages you to think, actually, it's not just about the theory, it is definitely about the action. And I'm somebody who sits, and I'm not saying, yeah, my form tutor created who I am, but an experience when you're in secondary school where you are just starting to get to grips with the way that the world sees you, and it not being a positive thing. It can be a very daunting place. We know what it's like for young people. So to have that, and our service users and the clients that we work with, they are not always seen in the best light also. So when we can be equitable, when we can be anti-racist, when we can be anti-oppressive, it has a massive impact for them. Thanks for listening to that bit. Next slide, please. So, as I said, my form tutor, she recognised who she was. She recognised that we were in a predominantly white school. She recognised that the material, she was a music teacher. So I'd say, I'm not interested in playing the triangle. I'm not interested. This isn't my music that I listen to at home. Why do I have to learn this? And she recognised that. So though she didn't have power to change the curriculum, she did recognise that actually she understood why I was disengaged from the curriculum in that way, and did try to help bring that in, help me to bring in my identity. So she would always ask me to, not just me, but other black students, she would ask us to contribute what we enjoyed. And so from a social worker and from a practice educator point of view, I think it's important that we recognise that the theories that we use are Eurocentric. And that's, I think, for me, one of the biggest things is the communication skills theory that we use, because, I'm lucky I get to sit in all kinds of arenas, but the majority arena that I sit in is usually I sit with black people. I have a black family. I socialise with a lot of black people. And we laugh amongst ourselves because we know that some of the way we communicate would not be deemed professional to others. it would be maybe deemed as aggressive, whereas actually it's a style of communication that isn't explored because it's not white. And so sometimes our clients come with that and we might judge them, or our practice, our students come into the placement and they might be demonstrating different types of communication skills that are not taught at university. And we dismiss those. We dismiss them, one, because we have to we're on a tight schedule. We have to get through things. We want to teach them things. But actually, in dismissing it, often what we do is we discredit them and say they don't have good communication skills, instead of saying they have different styles of communicating and recognizing how those communication skills might stand them in good stead in front of another audience, in front of the service users that we've got, in front of the clients. We also have a very British culture. So I think we talk about what's normal and how we socialise. And those norms and values that we bring into the workplace are not always the same norms and values. And when I talk about when we talk about critical race, I think it's really important at this point to recognise the minority race, people, the hidden minority of people who are white on the outside, but not necessarily British, because we don't recognise how they communicate or how they learn. So what I'm really wanting us to do, and what I think is really important, is that we reflect on who we are and how who we are impacts the way that we practice. It impacts the things that we prioritise. It impacts our knowledge base. It impacts the way that we behave. And so the next bit is for us to go into groups and have some questions. They are thought-provoking questions, but it's important that we start to have those discussions, because if we don't, we are just going to keep going around and around and around and wasting each other's time, really, and things won't get better. But we are saying, as social workers, we are committed to challenging oppression. So I think this is a place to start. So if we could go into the breakout rooms. Just as you're doing that, Polly, just to say, and the questions were quite difficult to get your head around, and it's a lot more than introducing yourself and trying to get to grips with them. So I think if people want to take those questions away and reflect on them, we will definitely welcome you to do that.
Thanks, Shalisha. Shall I move to the next slide? This section was designed to be a bit of a Q&A between myself and Nikita. Nikita, who's got lived experience, she's a social worker from an Asian background who is also disabled. But as we said at the start, she is unwell. We did have a previously recorded little section of her talking about her experience, which is on the next slide. But we weren't able to get the chance to talk about her views around intersectionality, etc. But I did have quite a few conversations with her leading up to this, so I'm going to try and encapsulate what she has said to me about it, and I've shared these slides with her. So the term intersectionality was coined back in 1989 by Crenshaw, who was exploring the experience of Black women, and her views were really that both feminism and anti-racism didn't actually encapsulate what was going on for Black women, because as it says here, the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of sexism and racism, and any analysis that doesn't take intersectionality into account can't sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. So her views were that intersectionality is a lens for understanding problems, really. So taking the British context, Crenshaw's American, thinking about the fact that older Asian women are at increased risk of suicide, you can't understand that simply by looking at the fact that they're women, they're from South Asia, or they're older. It's something more than that. It's the sum of all of those things and then extra layered on top. Likewise, the fact that over COVID, over that period of COVID that we've only just coming out of at the moment, 53.1% of disabled women reported having high anxiety. That's greater than men, that's greater than non-disabled women. And it's about that whole combination of factors. And from talking to Nikki, What she said is it's about the fluctuating and very individual nature of that intersectional experience. So for her, it's the specific area of Asia that she comes from. It's how she, as an individual, accepts or rejects any traditions that she's come from. It's about how she's individually affected by her various disabilities, and it's about all of that together. It's layering and compounding of those different isms and how people therefore react to her, how she reacts back to them, all of that fitted together. I've got a little video here, but I don't know if it's going to play over Teams. I think that you each have to click on it yourselves and make sure you're muted and play it in your own time. It's only about 6 minutes. Yeah, I think so. If you've got the presentation, it is embedded within that, and I can make it available on the Teaching Partnership website as well. One of the one of the sites that Nikki has really rated is diversity and ability. And 4 questions that are posed on that one of the blogs is, when you're thinking about your own practice, think about which communities are served and which aren't, and then explore why that is. Think about who gets to participate and who doesn't, and again, why. Who has access to resources and support and who doesn't, and again, why. And whose voices gets heard and whose don't. Think about that in relation to your services and in relation to your own practice is what Nikki has suggested in our conversations. So, for example, when we send students on placement, one of the early exercises we always suggest to them is to do a bit of a community mapping exercise. What does the local community actually look like? And who are the people who use this service? Is there a large part of that community who don't use the service, and what's going on there? Coming back to a lot of you will remember Arnstein's ladder of participation. And again, thinking about both the service and your own practice, that ladder of participation starts at the bottom where we are basically doing 2 people. We are the ones, the providers of the service. They don't get too much say in that. Going all the way up to where people have a real say in their own support and in the service generally. And it's useful to think about that as well. And what Nikki really emphasised was the need to learn from people with lived experience. To aim to have to develop a positive and open approach to people who are from different backgrounds, who have different life experiences. There's various tools to help you with that. A lot of you will be familiar with the Mandela model, which looks at that in relation particularly to people when you're supervising them, that kind of thing. But learning from that, when you're working generally, how do you take an approach that's going to understand other people's cultures and be open to other people's cultures?
Okay, so for this next section, we're going to talk to you a little bit about some research that we've been doing with students and practice educators who work with our students at the University of York. And we wanted to look into the placement experiences that our students were having because anecdotally, we kind of understood that they were having some difficult experiences. Their outcomes weren't quite the same as students who were not from minority ethnic backgrounds, and they were more likely to have difficulties on placement. And that was also borne out in national data about the attainment gap between white and minority ethnic students generally in the higher education sector and in social work programs. So we wanted to understand what was going on for our students who were going out into the range of local authorities and independent organisations that we use for placements. And I think some of the things that came up from that are actually quite more widely applicable. Of course, you start looking at just students on placement, but then you find out things or have to make connections with social work as a profession and higher education as an institution. So there are some things that we'll talk about which are quite specific to having placement students, not just for practice educators, for anybody. One of the key things was the experience that our students had within teams, not just their immediate practice educator, but the rest of the colleagues that they were working with in whatever placement organisation they were on. So hopefully some of the findings that we're going to talk about are relevant across the board, whether you're involved in practice education or not, or have had a student within your team or not. And they're interesting things for us to reflect on in terms of anti-racist practice. I'm just going to really briefly say what we did in this research so you get a sense of where this information is coming from. We had interviews or focus groups with 18 practice educators. We had a focus group with 3 university staff, and we were able to interview 5 students or newly qualified social workers who had only just qualified. And I think we were quite impacted by COVID in our original kind of design, but we were pleased that we managed to get a kind of range of views across practice educators themselves and some students as well.
All right, so I'm going to just talk to some of our main findings from the project. So first, there's a kind of contextual finding, you know, in terms of experiences of diversity within placements. It's always pretty obvious to us as university educators, but also thinking about where our placements are, that many of our placements aren't particularly ethnically diverse. And this really did come out actually quite a lot, I think, in terms of the data that we found. So, you know, this practice educator here said, you know, if you're someone who feels different in an all-white team, I think that must be incredibly difficult. So, you know, many of the teams we are sending students into are all-white teams, and I suppose practice educator here just reflecting on what that might actually feel like from a student from a minority ethnic background, and the student here talking as well about their kind of anxiety as well, again attached to kind of previous experiences of racism as well, which obviously Shalisha touched on in her slides, and thinking about those questions, you know, how is it that people's kind of previous experiences within society then influences how they might feel, particularly as students coming on placement, and you know, how that might bring forwards feelings of anxieties, feelings of concern or worry about feeling like they're going to you know, not fit in some way, or that people's attitudes are going to be an issue, which is what this student raised here. And not just in terms of thinking about, okay, fitting into a team, but also thinking about, okay, well, about the people that students might encounter when they're, you know, going out into practice. Actually, who we interviewed was that, you know, it's really like, we know that there's racism in the communities that we serve. We know that students who go and work with people are likely to encounter some form of racism. You know, whether it's, you know, in some cases very, very overt racism as well, and then there's a question there of how that can be dealt with. So, you know, for some practice educators, a lack of exposure to having students from kind of different diverse backgrounds, diverse ethnic backgrounds within their team, meant they didn't feel as confident or as comfortable in kind of addressing this when it arose, and that a really common view there that was that they would appreciate more training and professional development activities around race and diversity. And thinking about service users' responses as one thing, but also that kind of going back to that team and how students might feel within a placement. There's also a sense that there could be some kind of more subtle forms of othering from professionals that wasn't necessarily intentional, but could still cause a sense of exclusion. So some practice educators talked about how they'd seen students being mistaken for other practitioners. A couple of students also talked about this in terms of their own experiences, being called somebody else's name, assumptions maybe being made about them on the basis of their background. So kind of in terms of, Shalisha, you wanted to nip in?
Yeah, just very slightly, because just to say as well, not just not getting somebody's name right, but asking somebody for a name that's a bit easier to pronounce is a really big microaggression that often students don't feel able to challenge, and it's something that people do quite often. So I think it's one that people can try and rectify from immediately.
Yeah, absolutely, it's a good point. Ishmaeli, did you want to say something? Sorry, I've got.
Yeah, I have point of the point. I want actually to comment. I've been doing my placement. I think actually I did my placement this year, and there was a comment about language. Because I'm from diverse background, and there was comment about my language mentioned in the meeting in the placement. And it was kind of affect me mentally, to be honest, because it was like a derogatory comment, and I was vigilant to pick that up in the team, and the staff would just brushed it off, and it seems that was okay to comment that. Basically, there was nothing at that point. Nobody spoke to me about it, so I just dealt with it. I just took it in as, myself and just carried on. Yeah, I would like to talk broadly about racism, actually. My point of view, racism is an ongoing issue because I had experience in the community and in academic professional setting. I've been racist towards me. They said that I was a different person. To me, it's an ongoing issue, and it's good that there is awareness is being brought up and things that making this aware of the issue, and also I want to touch upon since 1921. Education in Britain was based on cultural competence, teaching cultural competence. I'm sorry, I'm dyslexic, by the way, so just let you know. Since 1921, the education system is based on teaching cultural competence, and there is no plan or anything done to tackle anti-racism. My point of view is investment on tackling anti-racism, an education system. This is my point of view broadly on how we could, raise awareness about it and things like that. Thank you for letting me.
Thanks for that contribution. Thanks for sharing that with us and your experiences. It's not always an easy thing to do, so thank you. And I think a few of the points you just made, and also what Shalisha raised. Sri, did you want to add in something here?
Yeah, I did. I think just specifically to go back to the easier name thing, there's another thought that I had about it, which was there's also in my experience, there's an expectation that you will acquiesce to the request that you'd give them an easier name, or you just say, oh no, don't worry, call me whatever's easiest for you. I mean, I have 3 names. I go by Shira. I mean, that's the name that I prefer to be known as, and it's a tricky name when you first read it. But the easiest thing to do is say, well, how do I say your name? And then I'll explain it. I've often found myself saying, oh no, the K is silent. Oh no, don't worry, nobody can say it. And it's almost like I'm saying, it's fine. Call me whatever you like. I'm okay with the disrespect, and that's an expectation that people have. But that shouldn't be the case. The K is not silent. It's not a hard name to say. And if you took about 2 minutes, you will be able to say it. And that's been my experience when I've sort of been able to address that with people and say, look, this is how you say it. Everybody is usually very, very gracious about it, and they accept it, and they kind of make the attempt. In the past, there has been times when people says, well, I could just call you Katie. And I'm like, no, you can't. That's not my name. You can try, but I'm not going to respond. But that's another thing, that there's an expectation that the person whose name is complex will be the one to acquiesce and make it easier on the person who's saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, and again, really resonates with what some of the students fed back to us in this project. And obviously, this is something that's clearly something that's you know, from what's been said here is also been common elsewhere. So in terms of your experiences, so I think things like names, things like assumptions being made about people's backgrounds and what that might mean for their practice was something that did come out quite a lot in placements. And I'll touch on that a bit more in a couple of slides actually around that. So kind of moving on to responses by placements. Sorry, Polly, can you go back a slide? Yeah, this one here, thank you. So there was a really broad recognition that there was a need to challenge racism and to protect and support students from kind of adverse experiences of racism in placements. But there was a real broad range of views and some uncertainty as well on the best ways of doing that. So a kind of a common theme here, I suppose, was that there's some complexities there that can be involved in engaging some service users that we work with. There's a tension, obviously, in social work that we can, particularly within statutory social work, where we're working with people who maybe don't necessarily want to work with us, but they have to engage in different ways. That there's a question there of some practice educators were saying, you know, the question of how to deal with racism from those service users could be quite complex at times, and you know, where there's a duty to provide services as well, and where social work relies on relationship building, where service users don't necessarily welcome social work involvement. Practice educators could sometimes struggle to get to grips with that. There was also a sense that there was maybe a lack of organisational support and guidance, and that these would be really important to support practice educators and teams more broadly in terms of responding to students' experiences of racism. Practice educators said they felt hampered by a lack of clear policy and procedures, and felt that potentially this wasn't just about students, but also thinking about colleagues from minority ethnic backgrounds as well, and that how does, you know, where do organisational policies support colleagues as well as students? Some practice educators made comparisons between policies operating within organisations that weren't local authority, such as the NHS, and felt that they really needed that kind of clear support and guidance. And where practice educators had experienced effective responses that had involved strong institutional guidance and also proactive support from team managers. So support from team managers was also really important here. The students themselves reported kind of some wariness about reporting racism to placements, or the university. This student kind of sums it up with, you know, and this maybe echoes some of the comments that have just been made as well, that, you know, sometimes when racist incidents happens, you know, I raise it, but then actually people don't know how to respond, and it kind of sometimes just gets kind of pushed to one side. And there's a sense there of students maybe not having that sense of security or safety and being able to report things and then feel that they're actually going to be actioned on. So another student, I'll just read out here, said, you know, this student was talking to a practice educator about experiences, and the practice educator that conversation in the first place. You know, instead of like her feeling like she had to suss out how safe it was, it would have been better if I'd kind of said to her in the first place, okay, these are the parameters within which we're working. You know, if you want to come to me with these things, this is what the response will be. Because she said, obviously, this student had an issue with a previous workplace and hadn't had that kind of support. So she said, reflecting back, that really shouldn't have been the student's responsibility to instigate that conversation, that as a practice educator, she should be doing that from the get-go, so students are aware of what will happen when they actually raise issues. I think this touches back on what Jenny was talking about in relation to colour blindness and issues around that. So there was an understandable desire by some practice educators, obviously, to treat students equally, and also some anxiety about directly addressing difference. So, you know, not maybe kind of the phrase, not wanting to make a song and dance about it came up quite a lot. So this is connected back to what I was just talking about in terms of having those conversations about dealing with discrimination from the start. Obviously, to have those kinds of conversations, you need to acknowledge the impact that difference can have. This practice educator sort of reflecting here about, well, actually, in the past we've pretended it isn't an issue, but actually maybe that isn't the most helpful response. And following on from that, kind of exploring identity, again, practice educators tended to emphasize about being about student reflection rather than necessarily being about the reflection of the team or practice educators themselves, and thinking about, okay, their own identities as well in relation to how they respond to students. Some practice educators did use some techniques and models. So, for example, in our chat, we talked a little bit about social graces. I know Polly just mentioned the Mandela model, and practice educators did use these tools to kind of surface these kinds of conversations and the kind of complexities that issues around identity can raise. So, for example, the practice educator here, again, it's not a quote on the slide, but I'll just kind of read it out a bit. That she was working with a student, and if there's a family of the same kind of culture or race, and you might be inclined to give that family to that student, but in thinking about the family needs, and that might be a good fit and a good learning opportunity, but equally you want to be mindful of, is that necessarily the case? Are there assumptions being made there about kind of matching students with different kind of clients? I can see there's a lot of helpful kind of discussion coming up in the chat as we're going as well. So yeah, so if anyone wants to kind of follow up on that, then do just chip in. So just to kind of finish off really in terms of the kind of broad findings, this comes back to what I was saying earlier about assumptions being made about students sometimes, and assumptions particularly being made about student capabilities due to kind of presumed cultural differences. So here, when we're talking about kind of talking to students, working in partnership with them in terms of exploring identity and discussions of identity and power, the flip side of that is where there's an emphasis on identity, which can also be experienced as quite alienating for students. And this came out quite a lot in terms of our interviews. So on the one hand, that could be, for example, around taking a deficit approach sometimes to minority ethnic students, so focusing primarily on issues and challenges in relation to values and skills such as communication. So this is, again, going back to what Shalisha was saying earlier, in terms of kind of what we would class as norms around communications, and whether that's actually, again, quite problematic, kind of adhering to that and not actually thinking in broader terms about what communication can look like. And that approach could be taken instead of a strengths-based approach, which would consider the cultural background of a student as a positive attribute. The second aspect of this was around some students sort of talking about, and practice educators also highlighted this, of students sort of being positioned as a cultural expert, so to speak. So the practice educator here says, the team wanted her to be an expert, and it was a bit, she didn't particularly feel comfortable with that. So one of the students talked, for example, about, she was a practicing Muslim, and someone in the team, not the practice educator, someone else, was asking her lots and lots and lots and lots of questions about her background and what that meant for her. And, it was quite full on. And she talked about that with a practice educator, and a practice educator said, well, this is the kind of thing in terms of actually, is that necessarily appropriate to have those kinds of conversations? And that student also talked about, for example, experiences of assumptions being made about what she was and wasn't allowed to do as a Muslim woman, and sort of saying, oh, well, are you on the basis of kind of like being a woman, is that going to be an issue in terms of being allowed to do things? And also saying, again, assumptions being made about what that might look like for her. Shalisha, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, I just wanted to chip in just there, just because I think I can really I can understand how some people might feel like, well, if we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. If we don't ask questions, we're seen as ignorant and we don't care. And if we ask too many questions, but I think my encouragement to people would be, would you ask this question of a white person? If you just got to know that white person and you were just getting to know them, are some of the questions kind of anchoring on highlighting that there's the difference is a deficit difference, as opposed to recognizing that their person is a person and their difference is just a different way, not that their difference is an alien way, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't want people to feel like asking questions is a negative thing. It's the tone of which the question is asked, as though you're visiting a museum. Don't ask people questions as though, ask them because it's relationship based, as opposed to reading an encyclopedia and trying to just know, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and I think that explains it really well, actually, the difference between those kinds of conversations. Yeah, like you say, being relational and being just interested in somebody because they've become part of your team, as opposed to, like you say, treating someone like as a cultural artifact, so to speak. So that's those were the kind of main findings that we came out, and also I want to emphasize here that, you know, senses of belonging and being part of teams, you know, students did also talk about that sense of being made to feel welcome in teams, that actually people had kind of really positive experiences and excellent support from practice educators, teams and organisations. But also alongside that, there were experiences of feeling isolated, feeling self-conscious, that could then reinforce negative perceptions of others in the teams by students withdrawing into themselves, and that could kind of perpetuate this sort of cycle of separation within a team. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. Okay, I know I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to pass on now to Kelly.
Hi, yeah, we don't have huge amounts of time to go through this, but I can see from the chat that it's kind of raised a lot of issues. People who are saying that some of the things we're talking about here have resonated with them and their own experiences. So that's really interesting. So I think it's also important to note that we were able to make some recommendations about what should happen going forward, take some action from all the different stakeholders, from the university, the staff in the department, placement organisations. So I'm not going to talk through the recommendations in much detail because we don't have much time, and also because I think it might be helpful if we could send out a copy of our report to interested parties from here today. So we could always send it on to you, where you'd be able to read the report of the findings and those recommendations in more detail. But perhaps the important thing to know is, you know, the kind of commitment that's come from the teaching partnership, from the placement organisations and the staff within local authorities, and from within the department. So whilst, you know, that lots of issues have been raised, and we can see they're still ongoing from our students who have joined us today to share their experiences, that things hopefully are moving, and there is a kind of a level of commitment coming now. And I'd be really interested, particularly to hear from current students who are able to read the report on what they think of those recommendations, or if they've got any other, you know, open to those, to have those conversations with students. So I won't read through all those recommendations for you. I hope if you're interested, you get a chance to read the report, and you can always kind of get in touch with us about what you think. And I think I'll pass on over to Jenny now, who's just going to tell you a bit more about one of the main things that came out of this project, and something we're really excited about coming up.
Thanks, Kelly. And again, I'm just going to give you a whistle-stop tour of this, but to let you know that we are just starting off on a new research project, which we're really excited about and which we want to give you a chance to be part of as well. The project is a book group and also a film group, which is looking at using books and films created by minority ethnic authors and filmmakers as a point of discussion, so that we can learn more about different communities within the UK. So we're going to be running these discussion groups within local authorities in our region sometime in the new year when we get them going. They'll be running monthly for about 6 months, and there'll be just a chance to get together and to discuss some really cool books, some different films, and learn a little bit about diverse communities, and a chance to discuss issues, some of the issues that we've been talking about today in a really sort of low stakes environment. So when we send out information about what we've been talking about today, we'll send out some more information about our new research project as well, and let you know about how you can be involved in that if that sounds like it's something interesting to you. So all that remains for us to say today is thank you for being involved today. We hope that it's been useful to you. I think that we have learned something through the conversation as well, and we hope that this is a conversation that we can really keep having as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you for having us as well.